Tonight we have Nate Brumley of Dry Fly Innovations doing his presentation on dry fly fishing for trout. Nate is a longtime supporter of Idaho 2 Fly, and we're so glad to welcome him back. Dry Fly Innovations is a family-owned business, and it's very much worth you checking it out. For many people, dry fly fishing is the best and only way to fish for trout. So I think you're going to find tonight's presentation very informative and educational, whether you're a rookie or a seasoned angler. So let's just enjoy this presentation. Here's Nate.
In the year of 2010, we had the opportunity to go give a presentation over in Bend, Oregon to a fairly large fly club over there, and had a really great time. We tied a few flies and gave a little presentation over there. And during that presentation, I had asked the group there, how many people fish exclusively a dry fly on the Deschutes River? And there were well over 100 people in the audience, and there was only one person that raised their hand and said that they fished a dry fly all the time on the Deschutes River. Well, we had the honor of being able to fish the next day on the Deschutes River, and we had expressed in the presentation that we didn't think that there's any place on earth or any river or any water conditions that you can't fish a dry fly. So anyway, we showed up at the river the next day, and we had the pleasure of fishing with a couple of the members of the fly group. So we head off down the river together, and we pull in at an island, and the little gal that I was with, she was kind of my fishing partner, and she wanted to come along with me and share some ideas and get some ideas about how maybe to best fish a dry fly on the river. So anyway, we get out at an island and we walk a fisherman's trail, which is always against my better judgment, but we walk a little fisherman's trail. We go across the island and we settle in on a stretch of water. It didn't look like particularly really good dry fly fishing area to me, but she had some experiences with catching fish on that little zone of water on a nymph. So anyway, she says, "You go fish this." So I moved in at the bottom end of the little run and I started to fish my way up through that little run. And all of a sudden, my fishing partner moves in ahead of me, goes right straight into the zone in which I'm casting into, and she begins to cast her fly into the zone of water. Immediately, I knew that that whole run of water through there at that point in time had been fouled. There would be no chance that I would catch a fish in that run of water. So we very hurriedly finished that little run, and we went down to the tip of this island where both areas of the river came together in a confluence right at the tip of the island. I was on one side of the island, and my fishing buddy was on the other side of the island, and I'm very slowly creeping down, and all of a sudden I recognized that my side of the river had a beautiful shallow riffle, and it went right into the confluence of the other side of the island, and there was a deep drop off right there and kind of a chop riffle that ran for about 20-30 feet. I saw that immediately as being fish water. I knew there would be a big fish living there. I very slowly snuck right down there, and I was going to deliver a cast up above and let the fly float down into that little zone. About the time I was set up to do so, my fishing partner comes right out on the very peak of the island, walks right out into that beautiful little zone where those fish, I knew that there would be fish living. I knew that that area of the river was totally fouled at that point in time. We went back to the boat, we moved downriver, and I recognized a spot against the edge that I thought would be great hopper fishing. We were in the month of September, kind of the tail out of the hopper season. So anyway, we pulled in there, and my fishing buddy comes along with me, and I get in the water, and she says, "You go ahead and fish it, I'll watch." So I began to fish up through the little stretch of hopper water, and all of a sudden my fishing buddy is out in front of me. There's a fairly steep bank, and she is about 10 feet up the bank, viewing down on the same water that I am addressing my fly into. Immediately I knew that any fish that would have lived in that 20 or 30 feet section of water, I knew that there was no chance that I would catch a fish there. We floated on downriver, and it's about noon at this point in time, and I have not caught one fish. Jeffrey, my son, he's doing pretty good. He's already caught like 6 or 8 fish, and I'm not having any success. So we move down and we pull into this little small island with a small little stream and a little riffle that came in along an edge. And we pulled in and we were going to have lunch there, which meant that I figured that we would sit in the boat as we did that. But the second that we launched the boat in along the edge of the bank, I piled out with my fly rod because I wanted to get a cast into something that was not contaminated before I put a fly in it. So I jumped out of the boat, had a little Adam's caddis on there, about a size 16, delivered it in the top of the riffle and floated it through. No fish. Delivered it again, and there was a riffle that came through kind of shallow, and then it was kind of deep as it dropped off. And I knew that there'd be a big fish laying behind that. And on the second cast I delivered, and that big fish came out and he ate. I set the hook in him, we fought him around, I landed the fish, and we were admiring him along the side, and they're beautiful fish on the Deschutes, red sides, hard fighting son of a guns. But either way, I'm preparing to release the fish, and out of the corner of my eye, across this little body of water, against the far edge, I see a glint of something that happens across that little surface. I'm looking at the fish here, but I saw that fish. I raised up my head and I saw the ripples of that fish that had just risen. I very quickly undid the fish, shot that fish loose, did kind of a pirouette, I guess you would say, dried the fly over my shoulder and shot it across that little branch of water, clear against the other edge. And on the first shot at that fish, he comes right out of nowhere and eats the bug. So in a period of 2 straight casts, we had landed a 16.5-inch fish and then a 17.5-inch fish back to back. By the time the day was over, there were 2 believers in the boat that you could catch a fish on the dry fly on the Deschutes River. And we had a great day. We caught over 30 fish, and it was a beautiful, beautiful fishing experience for all of us. But you know, there was one thought that was left in my mind when that was all said and done. I thought in my mind that how many fishermen out there that would go and address the fish in front of you on a dry fly, how many of those people would have used some of the same techniques that I was having to deal with during that day? This little gal I was fishing with, she is a this little gal could cast and hit her fly in a teacup at 65 feet away. This little gal can cast. She's a performer with a fly rod in her hand. But how many people out there fish and never even consider the fact that you're dealing with an intelligent being that's out there in the water and he understands your presence? How many people do not know how to make a proper approach to a fish? My name is Nate Brumley with Dry Fly Innovations, and welcome to Dry Fly Approaches. The first concept I'd like you to understand is there is a significant difference between nymph fishing and dry fly fishing. With nymph fishing, you can go right up to those areas of where those fish are in a deeper pool, and you can stand almost next to those fish and deliver your little stonefly nymph clear to the bottom down there where those fish are, and they are not near as skeptic about you being in the water when their feeding zone is completely down on the bottom. The closer that a fish gets to the surface of the water, the more skittish he becomes. And that is the rule you have to understand about dry fly fishing. Not only are they skittish as they get to the surface of the water, the whole plane of the surface of the water and all of the environment outside the surface of the water all of a sudden come into focus for that fish. He recognizes things not only at the surface, but clear through the surface in perfect peripherals that he's looking up through the surface of the water. So if you're a dry fly fisherman, you have to deal with the idea that a fish's vision is all of a sudden in play. And you have to deal with that issue every time that you approach any fish in any situation. So always keep that concept in mind. You do not have to be near as stealthy on a nymph as you do on a dry fly. You have got to be able to approach these fish without their recognition of you being in the water with them. Now, I'm going to start you off real negative here, and we're going to talk about things that you never do. The first thing that you never do is you never wade through a zone of water close to an edge until you put a dry fly in it. And here is exactly the reason why. Here we are now, and we're wading upstream, delivering a fly upstream on a dead drift. Watch where these fish are being hooked. These are the same zones. These fish are being hooked in the same identical zones that you would be wading through. So you never wade through those locations until such time that you've put your fly hook in that location. Oftentimes a big, fat, old, lazy rainbow or a big old fat brownie, he's going to live in those locations with quiet water and a constant stream of food coming over his head. And oftentimes that's really close to the edge, just like what we're looking at here. You can see that Steve Hardy, one of my fishing buddies here, you can see where he's delivering this fly along the South Fork of the Snake River, fishing upstream. And watch how close in that fly is delivered to the edge. And that is the reason why you never walk through these locations until you put your fly through there, because there's a lot of big fish that live in those locations. Now, the next thing that you never do is you never put your waders on and prepare all your gear until you have rigged your rod. The first thing you do when you arrive at the river is rig your rod. And there's a reason for that. You want to make sure that your rod is rigged, your fly is tied on, it's clipped into its little holder, and your leader is getting a really good, thorough stretch before you make your first cast or address your first fish of the day. That means you put on your waders, you get all of your gear done after you have rigged your rod. And that means the first delivery that you make to a fish out there in open water is a perfect delivery on a perfectly stretched line, on a perfectly tied knot into your fly. The photo that you're looking at in front of you now is on the Henry's Fork of the Snake River, and this is up on the ranch section of that river. And you'll see a trail that runs along above the stretch of water there. Most people call that a fisherman's trail. In my book, that has always been an idiot trail, because anyone that wanted to fish that stretch of water that you see underneath that trail, if you wanted to fish that stretch of water and you had walked that trail, every fish for 40, 50 feet out along the edge of that particular stretch of river, if you would not catch one fish along that edge, because that angle where that trail is the perfect angle that fish see best in that concave vision that they see up above the surface. They see every person that walks by on that trail. And they are then in tune with the idea that someone is in their presence, and any fly that would float over their head at that point in time, they would have absolutely no interest in. Do not ever walk the fisherman's trail if that is a zone of water that you want to fish. Look at the little ridge that's behind that fisherman's trail. Always make your access points off of any fisherman's trail. Most fishermen's trail go right through the center of exactly where those fish are living, and they are totally visible on that fish. This screen shows you another idea about clothing and what it is that you should always wear when you fish. You should never, ever wear a white hat. That is at the very top of the height of your body, and anything that sets up there that is discolored or light colored is just like a big flag on the top of your head, which fish can identify from a significant difference. Your shirt should never be white, and it should never be light colored. In any of the video that you will ever see that we do, you will never see me in a white shirt or even a light colored shirt. Everything is drab in color, dark olive, anything that is darker in color. The other thing that you never do is you never stand out on the end of a point, just like this guy is doing, out in front of the fish, and then making a big advertisement that says, "Hey, I'm here. You can see me, and I'm ready to catch you." All of those fish will recognize your presence. And at the second a fish recognizes your presence, your ability to catch that fish has just diminished to the point to where you don't stand a chance. The next concept I'd like to share is the idea that you never put your fly line directly over a fish's head. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but in any situation, whether you're fishing upriver or you're fishing downriver, you never want your fly line to ever be over the top of a fish's head. The next thing that you never do is you never fish with any kind of tapered leader or tippet that is not absolutely perfect. All of your knots tied perfectly, everything about your presentation from your dry fly line to your fly, it must be perfect. And you never fish with anything that is subpar in any way when it comes to your tapered leaders and your tippet. The next screen that you're seeing in front of you is a road, and there is a river below the road. This is a very common situation that you would run into no matter where you fish. You're always on a road, and in most cases, and you're always having to go down off some kind of a bank to the river. Keep one thing in mind about entering any river. It is always the most opportune time for a fish to actually identify you. When you are above the fish, sliding into the water is the most prevalent time that you can be seen. If you are seen by a fish, we will not catch that fish. So look at this photo and then think in your mind, how do I reach the river off a road that is sitting above the river? How do I reach the river without being seen by a fish, either in the inside tributary or the outside tributary? What you do is you use the brush line as your shield, and you keep the brush line between you and the river until such time that you reach the river. Then you submerge yourself down in the water, you become lower profile, and then you're in. You must get in without the fish identifying you, and the time that they identify you most is when you're trying to get in. You must use every type of cover possible to get your access points into the river. The other thing that you never do is you never underestimate the power of a small bug. The series of photos that I'm going to show you here are all photos that have a size 20 or under fly in the fish's mouth. Never underestimate the power of a small bug. Now, the next sequence I'm going to show you in video, and there's no answer for this, and all I want you to do is, as I roll the video here, I just want you to identify feeding fish. Now, there's no wrong or right answer here, and what we're going to do in a little later section, we're going to come back to this section again, and we're going to review it, and I'm going to show you exactly where the fish are, but all I want you to do right now is just identify where you see a feeding fish. I'm hoping that you saw some fish in those runs of water there, but we are going to come back and review that at a later time. The point I want to make at this time is that in order for you to be a very good dry fly fisherman, you have to develop skills as being a great hunter. You have to develop these skills. You have to recognize certain things that happen at the surface of the water that equate to the fact that you locate the quarry in which you are hunting. If you can locate the fish, you will always stand the greatest opportunity of hooking that fish. So here are the concepts that I'd like you to begin to expand your ability and make sure that you have these abilities to recognize these fish. And I'm going to try to help you from the inside out. First off, Many times I will recognize a fish rise out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes even at a 90-degree angle, clear over on one side of me, I'll see something, a change of color, a piece of movement, a little bit of a ring or a gap or a blick or a sound, anything that would attract my attention. I'll look there and say to myself, was that a fish? And then I deliver my fly there, and all of a sudden that fish rises right up and eats the bug. It was a fish. You've got to be able to get at a point to where everything out in front of you that is the river, from bank to bank, straight out in front and all the way down the sides, you recognize everything that happens around you. And that is training your peripheral vision and knowing what that vision is looking for. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that. The other thing that you have to be able to do is read a ring. When a fish comes to the surface, whether it's just a teeny tiny little dapple or he jumps completely out of the water, he creates an imprint behind where he is fed. That imprint will always be a little riffle that comes off of that ring that he creates. Where you recognize and where you use this skill is when you're fishing up through a line of boulders, and I'll give you an example of this later. You'll be fishing up through a line of boulders, and all of a sudden an odd ring comes out from behind a boulder in quiet water, and it comes out and it meets up with a major riffle or a portion of the riffle, and you know one thing. There's a fish living there, and he's feeding behind that rock that you can't see, but you know he's there because he's given away his imprint, which is the ring he makes when he feeds. That ring can be recognized, and it is the impression that you pick up after you see a peripheral area of a fish that's rising. The riffle is always, or the ring is always the key to identifying exactly where that fish just rose. If you can find the center core of the ring, you've found where the fish lives. Get to a point to where you recognize anything that's an odd riffle or a little small ring coming out in directions sometimes that you can't even see. They can be very small, they can be very subtle, but they all tell you the same story. There is a fish that lives there and he just fed. The other thing that you have to also be able to do is you've got to be able to stand on a body of water. And you know what it's like to be on a river. There's all these quirky sounds that the river makes. There's the gurgles, and there's the little plunging noises, and there's all of these sounds that a river actually makes. The interesting portion of being on the river, though, there's only a few sounds that sound exactly like a feeding fish. You have got to be able to recognize what a feeding fish actually sounds like. And when that happens, you'll be able to get your vision to that fish quick enough to where you can pick up the ring in the center of the ring and identify exactly where that fish lives. Because one thing we do know, that if you see the fish, that fish will be a much easier fish then to target, and he'll be a much easier fish to catch. So if you casted just a little bit less, and you hunted just a little bit more, and you had those skills to be able to do that hunting, amazing, amazing the successes you'll have because of your ability to see, hear, and hunt. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of insight, and we're going to run a little footage here and things that you are to look for. And these are things that when they happen at the surface of the water, you can pick those up and at any angle, at any vision, out of the corner of your eye or straight on. It doesn't make any difference. These are what we call glitter bites, and glitter is what attracts your eye directly to where a fish may feed. Here's some classic example of glitter bites, and looking at it from that standpoint, here's glitter bites. Now you can see that we're on a real quiet surface here, and you see that little bit of glint when that fish takes the fly. That is what you train your eye to actually see at any direction. When that fish breaks the surface, there'll always be a light change that you need to be able to see. Now, we're going to go back to that little test that we had a little earlier, and we're going to slow everything down, and I want you to identify the fish that are rising there, and then we'll talk about that just for a second. So now that's slow motion, and I want you to look now as we go through, and we'll identify each of those fish in that screen that we looked at before. So here we go. Far left-hand side, slow motion, you can see the fish rise. Now straight in front of me, you can see the fish rise. Now the concept that I'd like you to understand here is in order to identify fish, oftentimes it is their head or the tip of their nose that actually breaks the surface of the water. You've got to be able to recognize that and it be imprinted in your mind that the second that that color change and that little familiar shape and mold of a head that breaks the surface, that you're able to see that at any angle that you may be able to look side to side, straight ahead, wherever it may happen, whether it's in fast water, slow water, calm water, totally dead water, you have got to be able to see a fish's nose and you've got to be able to see it from the concept that you train your eye to see it. So when a nose breaks the surface, it is always a dark backdrop, dark nose against a blue or shimmered backdrop. That is how you set up and how you identify a fish and how you hunt him when that happens. There'll always be a contrast. The contrast will rise, and then you'll focus on where the contrast is. You'll come and study that. That fish will come back. You'll be keyed exactly where that fish is, and you'll know exactly how to approach that fish for a successful hookup and a successful land. Now we're going to simplify approaches overall. There are basically in dry fly fishing only two approaches. There is an upriver approach where you enter in at the bottom of a run of water and you fish up through that stretch of water and you're casting upstream on a dead drift. You almost always do an upstream delivery when there's no hatch on the water and you're basically doing what is called searching. You are casting a searcher fly out into holding water and you're trying to lure those fish up from the bottom. Now, the other type of fishing is what's called upside down approach fishing, and that is almost always done when there's a hatch at the surface of the water and there are fish up there feeding. And upside down simply means that you change directions and you move in on those fish from above and you're casting your fly line or your fly directly to the nose of the fish. So there are two approaches: upstream out of the hatch and you're searching, or downstream in the hatch, serving the fly to the nose of a fish. Now, the first approach we'll talk about is an upside down approach. But before I run the footage here, I want to talk to you about what you're seeing in the screen. On the screen in front of you, you'll see a break in the water to the left of me. You'll see me standing off to the right at about a quarter angle downstream to the fish. But the other thing I want you to recognize is look at my position. I'm not faced at the fish, straight on the fish. My body is quarter angle to the fish. My head is below, my neck is below my shoulders. I'm turned at a side angle to the fish that I am approaching. We're on a great big old open stretch on the Harriman's Park section of the Henry's Fork. These are some of the smartest fish out there in the world. And if you'll notice how I'm approaching this fish, I'm hunkered down to the lowest point I can be to still be able to deliver a fly. Now there's a purpose for that. In all wild creatures, the absolutely most terrifying thing to all wild creatures is exactly what you're looking at as you look at me right now. You see my head, you see my neck, you see my shoulders, and that spells one thing to all wild creatures. This is the same silhouette that shoots at me, and it's the same silhouette that hooks me. They recognize you through the peripheral and through the surface of the water, and they recognize you as a danger from the silhouette that you create. If you look at the photo in front of you and the footage that I'm going to run for you, you can see that I'm doing everything in my power to break my silhouette and stay as low in the surface film as I can possibly be given my scenario. So with that idea in mind, let's run an upside down approach this is in a hatch. I've seen that fish feed. He's working on some caddis. So basically what I'm doing is I'm serving to a feeding fish from above on a quarter angle and serving what we call an upside down approach. Dry the fly, lay the fly very carefully and softly out in front of the fish. The big rainbow comes up and eats, and we've got a fish in the net. Here again, we're on an upside down approach. On the Henry's Fork, fast water in a dray catch. These are all done on a downhill approach. Now, let's talk a little bit about an upriver approach. As we had mentioned before, that would mean absolutely one thing, that there is no hatch that's going on at the surface of the water. So what we're doing on an upstream approach is we're delivering flies that are designed to make a fish come up and eat at the surface and lure him to the surface outside of the hatch. So this is what an upstream approach would look like. Now you can see we're delivering the fly along the edges here on an upstream angle, letting it dead drift back to us. Very simple. Now, in order to fish those two approaches, there are two classifications of dry flies that you must thoroughly understand. There is what's called a searcher fly, and there's what's called a hatcher fly. Each of those flies are designed to be able to fish in two different scenarios. A searcher fly, when there's no hatch going on, and a hatcher fly that we're going to match exactly what the hatch is. Here's some examples of those flies. These are what's called searcher bugs. These are bugs that we are casting into holding water, luring fish to the surface. The next group of bugs are what's called hatching bugs, and they are a group of bugs that are tied specifically for a designed hatch that is happening at the surface of the water that we match perfectly and serve to the nose of a fish. Now, there are also other things in your approaches that you must know about flies. And one of them is what kinds of flies to use in certain types of water conditions. Now, if you're dealing with really slow water conditions, one of the most difficult fish that you'll ever try to hook in your whole lifetime is a great big old fish feeding on slow moving water with a very slick surface. You will not catch that fish on a great big high floating bug. You must have these very low belly down plain bugs that lay right in the surface film if you're going to have success catching fish on slow water. Here are 4 examples of bugs that we call belly down presentations. Now, if you're fishing faster water, then you have got to be able to support that bug or make it float in those zones where we're serving to faster water in holding water where these fish live. These are 4 examples of fast water bugs. They will ride a little bit higher in the surface film, and they will float in all water conditions. You must have bugs that do present themselves in all water conditions. Oftentimes when I'm fishing a line of water, I don't change out a fly because it's not being successful for me or it's not catching fish. I change out of a fly because I'm moving into a different water condition that I may have to address on a different plane, or I want the bug to lay at a certain level on the water. Okay? Now, we're going to go into some scenarios now, and we're going to talk about ideas about how to improve your ability to catch fish in all scenarios. The first scenario I'd like to talk a little bit about is actually utilizing your cover. There's a small pod of fish that are feeding just beyond this boulder. I'm going to try to sneak out here and dapple the fly over the edge and maybe get one of them to take. We'll see. Now, in this scenario, I had seen a little ring of a fish rise behind that rock. I was identified the location, make the cast, using the rocks as protection, serve the fly to the fish. Now here again, I'm fishing in a searcher position on a hopper upstream, but notice that I keep the boulders in front of me to block my vision so the fish do not see me sneaking up on their feeding position. Utilize your cover, whatever that might be. We're on a high mountain lake now, and I'm fishing over the top of a great big old boulder, and I'm using it as cover in that crystal clear water. Now look where the fish is, and look where I've addressed the fish from. The next scenario I'd like to talk about is that upstream approach that we had talked about earlier. Now, we know if I'm fishing upstream that I don't have targets or there's no fish feeding at the surface, I am throwing my fly to holding water, but there is a certain way that you do that. And as I run the footage, I'll actually explain what we're doing here. I'm fishing upstream, but you can recognize that my fly line is always landing at an angle. It is a cross-river angle. That's what we call a quarter angle. And that way your dry fly line never goes over the top of a fish. Now, the next fish that we're going to address here, he's going to be on the other side of the river, but look at exactly where I'm positioned to cast at that fish. I'm on the other side of the river. I hook the fish on the other side of the river. If you always keep a quarter angle, even on this scenario we're looking at, a beautiful quarter angle to these fish, they never see the fly line and all they see is the fly. That is absolutely critical to catching fish. Now, the next approach we're going to talk about is a downstream approach. We skated on that just briefly, but I want you to watch the delivery on this. There is a large brown trout that is feeding right below that big boulder that you see. Now, I want you to watch the delivery on this and look at the way I'm approaching that fish from above. I'm about a quarter angle into where the fish is actually laying, but watch the way that the cast is performed. I lay the fly out on the water and I sweep the fly line up above the fish. And what that's creating is my fly line above the fish, and the only thing that will actually address the fish is just my fly. Watch how that's performed. See the sweeping angle of my wrists right there as I sweep the fly line upstream to where it's a perfect delivery into this big brownie. Now we're on a boat here, making a delivery on a downstream angle directly into the fish. It's the same principle. Now we're in the winter, fishing a little blueing olive. And again, I'm upstream of the fish that I'm trying to deliver to, soaking that fly down to where that fly is delivered to the fish's nose. And when I'm delivering that fish to a fish's nose from above, the only thing that that fish actually sees is just my fly. There's no fly line, there's no tapered, there's no tippet. The only thing that that fish sees, if I can get above him and serve the fly downhill, the only thing he sees is my fly. Now, the next scenario, against a shallow edge. We've already established the fact in this presentation that a lot of big fish live really in close to the surface, in close to the edge of a stream. Now, if you look up along the bank that you're looking at here on this shallow edge, if I were to stand directly in against the bank and try to cast straight upstream into this line of water, the first thing that would happen is my fly line would drop over the top of that fish, and a fish that is living in very shallow water is very skittish. The second your fly line lit on top of that fish, he would scoot on out to deep water and you would not have an opportunity to catch that fish. But if you angle out in the water and make a quarter angle cast back into that fish, the only thing again that he will see is just your fly. Here's how that's performed when you're dealing with a shallow edge. Now, there is a fish living in real tight behind that boulder. You'll see him rise up and eat here in just a second. You don't see me in the picture though, because I am out on the edge of current and I'm casting back inside to the fish. Same approach that we're using here. You cannot cast over the top of these fish's head when they're in shallow water in tight. So you must gain your angle from the outside and cast into the fish to where you don't scare him. Now we're on a shallow edge again here, and we see a fish rise. We are almost straight up river from that fish. So what we're doing here is we're moving in at an angle out into the river. And what we're going to do is put that quarter angle cast in over the top of that fish and put a hook in him. The next scenario I'd like to talk about is undercover, because oftentimes you've got to be able to maneuver a fly hook into some ridiculously tight little positions. And the reason why you have to do that is because that's where fish live. So anyway, the next little section here is dealing with cover and working your flies in undercover. Now here's an old rainbow, a big old rainbow feeding back underneath a pile of brush. Now look at the way that we're staging on him. We're moving clear up at an angle to where we can put that fly perfectly into where that fish is, back in the little cubby hole where he's living. Now here we are again, same little brush pile, and we're going to deliver it in again at that soft little angle in behind the brush, hook the fish, and be able to land that fish working around the brush. Here we are on a scenario on the South Fork of the Snake River, and see that little teeny tiny patch of brush hanging over the surface water. Fish attract to these locations, and the reason why they do is there's a ton of feed that comes in there, and they feel protected underneath these brushed in areas. That's the reason why they live there, and that's the reason why you've got to be able to get your fly into those locations, because that's where a lot of big fish live. Now, the next scenario I'd like to talk about is boat fishing. When you boat fish, you're always going to be mostly on these fairly large rivers, and you're going to be hucking your fly in tight against an edge. Now, there is a certain way that you deliver those flies against an edge, and we're going to take a look at that and discuss that in this little video on boat fishing, and I'll show you two separate techniques that you can use. First off, when you're boat fishing, you always want your fly hook to always be out in front of your leader. That is very, very critical. So you're casting at an angle and you're doing a small roll cast always upriver with your fly line, and that way the fly always lands below your fly line. That is a perfect presentation. You're noticing that the little roll cast on the end, always upriver, will put that fly in a perfect position to serve that fly to a fish on a downstream delivery. So mending is important also when you're dealing with fishing out of a boat. Now here is another technique for boat fishing, and oftentimes it goes back to the idea about stealth and the ability of a fish to see you. You'll notice that I'm in a boat fishing against a fairly wild edge right here, and I'm hooking fish just kind of one right after another. but I'm sitting in the boat. And not only am I sitting in the boat, I'm crouched down in the boat, because in crystal clear water, those fish can look right up through that surface film and see you. So don't approach them on your feet, approach them on your rear end to where they can't see you. The next scenario I'd like to talk a little bit about is fast water scenarios. And if you look at this picture of the fast water, you've got a kind of a rapid that's coming in and beginning to flatten out. There's a lot of fish that live in those kinds of really oxygenated areas because they serve a lot of food. And there are a lot of turbulation that comes into those little slicks. But the problem is you can't fish fast water like what you're looking at here. You cannot fish that with a dry fly from above. So the technique and the scenario here is, and how to address this, is you're always going to move in underneath these fish, and you're going to fish upriver. Now watch what we do. We put the fly line in these little zones that are right against fast water. That's where the fish are suspended. They're right on the edge of that water that is delivering them food, and you're putting the fly exactly on those little zones. Now, you'll notice as we're serving here, see the little soft area in between the harder moving currents? Those will always harbor fish. Always on the inside edges will also always harbor fish. The idea here is that you are coming from an approach from the bottom, and you are working in and out of all the little zones within that fast water, and you're extracting the fish one after another, but you're doing that from an upstream approach. The next scenario I'd like to talk about, you'll often find yourself on totally calm water, or you'll find yourself on a lake. There's a certain slow water approach that you really do need to make. I'm going to run the footage here, and there's two things that I'd like you to recognize about this footage. This is a little place called Silver Creek. And this is a very, very shallow little pond on Silver Creek, and the fish in there are just like highly intelligent. Everyone tries to fish them, and most of the time no one catches them. But if you wait for certain weather conditions to work on your behalf, all of a sudden that could open up the gate for vulnerability to fish in certain locations. I use two techniques. I let Mother Nature and a hard wind shear the surface and blur the surface for the fish, number one, and then I use what little teeny tiny bit of cover that's around this very slow moving water, and I take advantage of some big fish because of two weaknesses. They can't see me, I'm hid, and number two, there's a wind that is blowing across the surface. I don't even fish this pond if the wind is not blowing. So we're on the pond, I'm delivering. And in this situation, I'm delivering a little black ant, a little terrestrial, a natural that they see often and always because all the brush and all the timber around that particular lake. An ant is a natural to serve in that scenario. But notice where I came from behind. I hooked the fish, and you see me step out? It is the only high stand of brush that is in there that's close to me, and I've utilized that to perfection. And you can see the wind blowing out across the lake there, and it is keeping everything separated, everything calm or moving at the surface so the fish can't see me. Now, there's a concept that you still must understand about hatches and certain specific hatches that happen on the water. They always come in three phases. There's an emerger stage of that hatch, there's a hatching stage of that hatch, and there's an adult to that hatch. You have got to be able to recognize the fact that there are three distinct segments of a hatch that actually happen. There will be times that fish will actually key on one of those three stages within the hatch, so it isn't good enough to match your hatches to the adult bug only. You must have stages of every hatch that might happen out there in the real world as a dry fly fisherman. There's ways that fish at the surface can tell you exactly what is transpiring. If you have fish that are feeding out ahead of you and you see their head come above the surface of the water, anytime that his head breaks the surface of the water and you actually see a separation of his mouth and see him eat, he is eating probably an adult bug at the surface, because he has got to clear the surface to be able to get on top of that bug to be able to eat that bug. So if you're seeing a head at the surface, you know one thing. He's probably eating an adult, and the flies that you're seeing on the screen are examples of adult bugs. Now, if you're seeing a fish at the surface, and this will oftentimes happen in really slow-moving or very calm water, if you're seeing a fish out there that is making this teeny, teeny, tiny little ring, basically what that fish is feeding on is an emerger. And he's at the point to where he's trying to break his way through the surface film. Sometimes he's even suspended upside down. The two flies that you're seeing on the screen here are flies that are actually designed to fish in exactly those kinds of conditions. If you're seeing a fish and he's coming to the surface and his head is clearing the surface and he's eating bugs, but you're casting an adult bug to him and he's not eating that, there's a very good chance that he may be keying on what's called a hatching bug. The three bugs that you're looking at on the surface now are examples of hatching bugs, and you must be prepared with all three of those types of bugs in order to be totally successful in these hatches. I'm going to share a scenario with you that will happen to you often if you're a dry fly fisherman. And here's the scenario. There is no hatch at the surface of the water, and you're fishing upstream, and all of a sudden you see a fish rise. You know three things immediately. That the fly that you're using is a searcher fly. It's not a hatcher that's designed to cast to a specific fish in a hatch. You're trying to lure fish up from the bottom. The second thing you know is that you are fishing upstream because you're using a searcher bug. The other thing that you also know is that fish is feeding on small bugs, because if you're looking at the surface of the water, you would be seeing, you're in the water with that fish, you would be seeing what he is eating. If you could see what he was eating, then you would go ahead and tie to that, match it perfectly, and serve it to the fish. But what that fish is doing is he's taking an opportunity, and what he's doing is feeding on small bugs. All indications are telling you that. So, what is it that you do? First off, you move to a quarter angle, so you're not casting directly over the top of the fish, and then you serve the fly to the fish. That is the fly that you have tied on. It's probably a searcher bug, as we have discovered. You serve the searcher bug to the fish, and there's a fairly good chance, if he's keyed on small bugs, there's a fairly good chance that he will not eat your searcher bug. So here's what you do. You go to the sweet six. These are the 6 bugs that I keep in my box at all times in situations just exactly like what we're talking about. The first 2 bugs that you see in the upper left-hand corner, the first one is what's called an Adam's caddis, and the second one is a bear belly caddis, both in small sizes, size 18s and size 20s. If the water conditions are moving very quickly, you go with a fly that's built and designed to float in that little bit harder water. Now, if fish is feeding in a gentle current or gentle riffle, then you would go with the next 2, the cabbage, or you could go with the emperor caddis, either of those 2. Now, if the surface water that this fish has risen in is real slow moving, very calm surface, then what you would do is go with a belly down approach, which would be the tantalizer, or it would be the colored emerger. I'd like to talk now a little bit about what is the great myth of dry fly fishing. All the time at presentations that we do all over the country, there's one common theme we always hear, and that is that you can't catch a fish on a dry fly unless it's in a hatch, and you can't catch a fish on a dry fly unless the fish are up at the surface eating. That is absolute hogwash. You can catch a fish on a dry fly at any time of day, whether it's day, morning, evening, whenever it might be. You can catch a fish on a dry fly, and you can do that consistently, even if they're not at the surface feeding. But you do have to have some combinations in your favor. Number 1, you have to have the right searcher bug to serve to these fish in appropriate locations where those fish live. The second thing you have to have is you have to have the ability to discover what is the right searcher bug to be able to use to get these fish to commit to the surface and come and eat. If you always let the river give you the inside information on what searcher bug to tie on, you'd be amazed at how many times that if you understand holding water and you know where a fish lives and you are able to serve that searcher bug perfectly to those locations where fish live and where they hold, you'll be amazed at how often that fish will just roll up out of nowhere and eat your searcher bug. But you do have to take some lessons from the river. The first lesson that you really have to know is that when you enter the river in the morning on the day that you're fishing, something had transpired the night before. There was food being delivered to fish from something, and the way to be able to determine that is go to the edges of the river in those little foam lines that accumulate in against the edge. It will give you inside clues about what the fish ate last night. If you knew what they ate last night, you would know that what exactly that you could put on your tippet on that morning that would tie into the idea of a memory that they had from what they ate last night and tie it to what you deliver over the top of their heads, and all of a sudden you have fish commit to the surface and eat your dry fly. Now, the next little footage that I'm going to show you here, is a classic example of what happens on a dry fly, and the reason why you just absolutely do not need a hatch to be successful with your dry fly. In the footage that you're going to look at here, you will see absolutely no fish feeding at the surface, but all of a sudden they come out of nowhere and they eat your dry fly. You've got to know exactly where fish live. You've got to be able to read holding water. But if you serve your dry fly to holding water where fish live, then all of a sudden they will just appear at the surface and they'll eat what it is you're serving. This is all a classic example, and you'll see that we're just kind of catching fish one right after another. But in this whole stretch of footage that you're looking at here, you will not see one fish rise to the surface and then me serve to the fish. That just didn't happen because the fish are not keyed at the surface. There's no real hatch going on, but yet those fish are still laying down there in those runs of water. They're laying down there and they're always looking at the surface for an opportunistic time to come to the surface and eat a searcher bug that you have identified. In this case, we're using a little combination. We're using a bullet head hopper, which is a great searcher bug because hoppers don't really hatch. They just occasionally reach the water. So he's a great searcher bug, but we're using a combination here of a bullet head hopper, and then up in some of these faster zones, we're using a caddis. At times the fish will pull off the hopper, and a caddis is a great searcher bug for fast moving water. This caddis that we're using here is called an emperor caddis, and it has some great success in these faster moving areas. We're also showing you areas here in this footage where these fish live and the holding water in which we're catching these fish. If you can recognize holding water, then you'll always have success catching these fish because you know exactly where it is to cast your fly. We have a whole nother presentation that deals with that scenario that called Dry Fly Essentials. Now, the last concept I'd like to share with you in approaches is the idea that if you took the time and the effort and you did the staging and you did the beautiful approach and you hooked a darn fish, I have another just thing that I always do. And my concept is this: I will not let a fish lick me. I don't care how hard he fights, how far I have to run, or what it is that I have to do to put a fish in the net. If I put a hook in him, then by golly, I'm going to land him. And I'm not going to let that fish whip me no matter what it is that he does. Now, here's a classic example. If you live by a stupid rule like that, here's what it will get you into. We're on a stretch of water here, fishing a caddis on an upstream delivery. Fish rises up. We put a hook in the fish. Fish jumps, shows us that he's going to be a pretty feisty son of a gun. All of a sudden, the fish comes sweeping down by me. I'm reeling to try to keep slack. The fish goes right by me. he jumps. He's decided now that he doesn't even want to be in the same county with me. You see him jump out in the middle of the river. Now, if you look very carefully, you'll look clear across the river. That is my fly line and part of my backing. He is completely over against the other side of the river. Now he just will not slow down. The fish just keeps on going, but I am not going to let him lick me. So down the stream we go. I'm even at a point now to where there's some fishermen below me, and the fish is encroaching now on their stretch of water. But what am I to do? I've got a hook in the side of that fish's head, and I haven't got much of a choice. So anyway, now we're down here, and I'm kind of encroaching down on the water where they're fishing, but I can't hold the fish, and the fish keeps going. So anyway, we're pulling in now, and I'm finally starting to get the best of this son of a gun. I get him in the net, and take a look at how far downriver that is. So if you live by an idiot rule that says that I'm not going to let a fish lick me, then this is basically where it could take you. To finish our video today, we would like to share a music video that we have done, and the name of this video is called Hooked.
I'd like to thank Nate for tonight's presentation. It was as informative and educational as I thought that it would be. If you have questions for Nate, you can either send an email to Idaho2Fly, or better yet, get on his website, dryflyinnovations.com, and you can ask him questions there. So Nate, thanks again. So next week, be sure to tune in again. We're going to have Chris Girano. He is a longtime fishing guide in the Pacific Northwest, Montana, Idaho, Oregon. He is going to have a very good presentation on entomology. I know you'll find this very interesting. So that's next Wednesday night, 7 p.m., same time, same channel. We'll see you then. Thank you.